Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to be here, as always, and with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, we got a big week here around Washington. The new president is going to be inaugurated. We see President Obama getting ready for his grand exit, and Donald Trump to be making his upcoming inaugural speech and making his big scene onto the public arena here as President of the United States. I read an article today that the whole world is concerned and worried about what this portends, and we really don't know, except, Richard, he's already promised, though, that one of the first things he's going to do when he comes into office is he's going to build his wall. And we've talked about immigration in past shows, but I thought, maybe we ought to revisit this issue, because if he's going to make it a centerpiece of his administration, I was really hoping he'd drop the ideas. It's absolutely ridiculous. But apparently he's not. He says that he's going to start building this wall. He says he's going to make Mexico pay for it. So I thought, well, we ought to revisit this issue. It's an important issue. There's also going to maybe be some conflicts with the states like California, particular cities, the so-called sanctuary cities, where the police are not enforcing immigration laws and the feds want them to enforce immigration laws. So I thought, let's go back and talk about this issue. And let me just start out by saying that, people think that this wall is going to solve their immigration woes. And I've seen this for the last, 40, 50 years, that every time there's a new immigration reform proposal, that people have this hope, this dream, that finally the immigration crisis that they've been lamenting, that they've been pacing the floors over, that they've expressed an anxiety over, is finally going to come to an end, that this is going to solve all their woes. I mean, you see it as an analogy over in the healthcare field that, if they just repeal Obamacare, that'll solve all the problems. Well, it won't solve the problems, because there is a root cause of these problems. And unless you get to that root, you're not going to solve anything. In fact, the probability is you're only going to make things worse. And I've been telling this to people year after year for decades. It's like somebody banging their head up against a wall over and over and over again, maybe against Trump's immigration wall. And they say, oh, gosh, Jacob, I've got this horrible headache. I just don't know what to do about it. I need to come up for more solutions on my headache. Maybe if I take more aspirins or whatever. And if you say, look, maybe if you just stop beating your head up against the wall, that might solve your problem. Oh, no, I have a right to keep beating myself up against the wall and so forth. And that really describes the immigration issue. That the center root of the problem is government control. In a sense, socialism. That's what immigration controls are. They're socialist central planning. You've got this board of commissars up in Washington that decides the planning decisions of millions upon millions of people that are trying to migrate freely in pursuit of a better life or work or what have you, and including with American employers who wish to hire them with what is purportedly their own money in the businesses that they own. And so you have all the dislocations, all the crises that come with socialist central planning. And so the only solution to the woes of socialism and central planning is to dismantle the socialism and central planning. Just piling one reform on top of another reform, whether it's making the transportation of illegal aliens illegal, and then making the employment of illegal aliens illegal, and then building that fence along the border, and now building this wall. None of it's going to do any good, because it doesn't get to the root of the problem. Now, what happens if you get to the root of the problem and you pull the weed out by its root? Well, now we're talking about freedom and free markets. That's the only thing that works. And I think that when that finally settles into people, that socialism will never work. No matter what they do, immigration controls will always produce dislocations and crises. Then that's what the day will be. You know what? Libertarians are right. The only thing that works in life is liberty and free markets. And now we're talking about the free movements of people across borders back and forth without regard to, oh, my gosh, we got to monitor them. We got to keep control of them. In other words, the same liberty that we have across states where people don't get anxious that everybody from California is going to move into New York, or that everybody from a low welfare state is going to move into a high welfare state. The same thing would exist internationally. Again, not only is that the moral approach, Richard, it really is the only practical approach.
Well, I have to tell you that I'm beginning to waver on this issue, Bumper.
Okay, we have to discontinue the show now.
For many years, I lived in New York, Michigan, and for 2.5 years now, my wife and I have lived in South Carolina. And I have refreshingly found that down here in South Carolina, there is not a huge number, but a significant number of libertarians and more reasonable conservatives. But now we're facing a threat, an uncontrolled flood of lefties and progressives from the northern states. And now I'm sympathetic about a huge wall along the South Carolina-North Carolina border to keep these commies out, and we're going to make New York and Michigan pay for it.
No, wait. Let me interrupt you for a second, because I know exactly what you're talking about. That, after the big economic collapse several years ago, I think it was the savings and loan crisis, a lot of the Wall Street guys were moving to Texas. It was when you and I were living in Texas at the time, and there were signs at all the businesses in Dallas that said, "We don't care how you did it in New York."
Well, I'll tell you another thing. When I moved to Texas, way back a long time ago, just before we met, I'm driving around with my car that still had New York license plates, and I'm at a stoplight, and there's a car in front of me, and the bumper sticker on that car in front of me said, "If you love New York, get out of town."
You're right. There are dangers to immigration.
And in fact, I had to renew my license, and because of a strange thing, I had to also take the new driving test down in Texas besides just the written test. And so this Texas Ranger is there to give me the driving test, and he looks at my application, and he says, "You're from New York? We're going to have some fun, boy." And that wasn't meant to be hilarious. So, so you have to watch these. You have to watch where these people come from. But on a serious note, do we have to be serious? Oh, yes. On a serious note, obviously the core problem is that we have lost our appreciation and understanding of the economic logic and the philosophic principles upon which the United States was originally founded. The fact is that up until the 1880s, when the first immigration barriers were introduced against Asians, the Chinese and then the Japanese, for all intents and purposes, from the founding of America and the establishment of the Constitution until virtually the First World War, the U.S. followed a policy of free immigration. If you were poor, if you were under religious or political oppression or persecution in Europe, for instance, all you needed to do was either through your own, admittedly, sometimes modest savings or your family members helping you, you bought passage on a ship across the Atlantic, perhaps down in steerage, with less of a comfortable ride than the cabins above. But you landed in New York Harbor, let's say at Ellis Island. And at that time, before the First World War, there were customs agents there. And they asked you two questions, basically. Do you have a communicable disease that if you breathe on someone, they could catch it? If you did, they kept you in quarantine until the infectious period had passed. The other question they ask, to use a politically incorrect term now, are you an imbecile? That is, do you have mental defect that would make you a dependent upon the charity of others. And here we're talking about the private charity. There was no welfare state at that time. But if you did not have a communicable disease, and if you didn't have what they defined as a mental defect, you left Ellis Island on a ferry boat to the south of Manhattan, the bottom tip of Manhattan, and you got off on the pier and you walked, and now you are free in America. No passports, no visas, and you were here now as a person who had a second chance to make a new life for yourself and your family, escaping from those hardships and oppressions and persecutions in the old world. That is how America got populated. And these are not easy choices that people made. I know that my grandparents on both my mother's side and my father's side came to America before the First World War, around 1904 and 1905, as very small children. They came here without knowing the language, no appreciation or understanding of American culture or street smarts, knowing very few people, in a setting in which now they were disoriented. But they came here with one purpose, to make their own life, and even if their life was not really improved, the life of their children and grandchildren. That's how the country got populated. That's how we became a diverse society that has made us the successful melting pot that through a good part of our history we have been. If I can just sort of elaborate on this a little bit more, but didn't people have a hard time? Well, a number of outstanding economists and economic historians, of which one notable one is Thomas Sowell, who recently retired at the age of 86 from his weekly syndicated column, unfortunately. In one of his books, he explained that when people arrived, let's say in Boston or New York or Philadelphia in that earlier part of the United States, what they did is they clustered in communities of similar ethnic or linguistic or religious background. As support systems, you got oriented. Someone took you in, helped you land your first job, guided you to where you might take a course to learn English. And from there, either they or their children then dispersed themselves to populate the continent of the United States. That is what made America great. Without government, without welfare state safety nets, all done by individual choice at individual expense through these local community and voluntary and private support networks that people like Sowell have emphasized in those earlier decades. Without that, America would not be the society that we take for granted today. This idea of a barrier across the border of Mexico ignores the fact that, in general, the people who wish to come to the United States today, Mexico, other Central or South American countries, or whether it be from parts of Asia or still Europe or even Africa, if you ask why do they want to come here, what is it that they're looking for in America, you find that they give the same answers as my grandparents and many before them and then after them. That is, economic opportunity for themselves and their families, escape from religious persecution, or to get from under political oppression. To have a situation in which, under our Constitution and its traditional understanding of individual rights and the Bill of Rights, you are viewed and judged as an individual. And that's how you make your life. You are not bound by either custom, tradition, or law to be part of a caste or a class or a group or a tribe that rigidly determines your future. That is what makes America great. These people are no different than the waves of immigrants in earlier years and decades. What is the primary difference? Well, they speak maybe some different languages, and they look a little different. Perhaps their skin tone is of a different color. But the fact is that other than that, they are no different than the waves of earlier immigrants that populated this great country and brought us their strength, their creative innovation, and their willingness to work hard, to work, save, and invest, that made America the envy of the world. Now, in the 20th century, these barriers were closed, particularly following the First World War in the 1920s with the new immigration restrictions, and they've continued now. But this is a hindrance to both freedom and America's future. It is not a help, and it is a disastrous turn of events that too many of our fellow citizens fail to appreciate this and do not want to sustain or return to the principles of free movement of people that made our country great.
Yeah, your point about the two questions is interesting on Ellis Island, because on the southern border, they didn't even ask those two questions. I mean, after the United States absorbed what was really the northern half of Mexico, which is remarkable in and of itself. I mean, here the United States absorbs the entire half of a country, of a foreign country. And along with all its citizens, its customs, its laws, its traditions, its language. I mean, everybody in Mexico spoke Spanish. So when you take over the whole northern half of the country, not surprisingly, everybody's going to be continuing to speak Spanish. And that's not just going to go away. So it's kind of amusing to see people, upset about there's just so much Hispanic influence in the Southwest. Well, duh. I mean, here you took over the entire northern half of the country. And after that, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the borders were totally open between the United States and Mexico. I mean, there weren't even those two questions asked. People just freely crossed back and forth the border in what had been their country. So it was natural for them to travel into Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona, parts of Colorado. For them, they're just traveling in their own country. And in fact, I once asked a guy from Mexico whether it felt different. He had come up to work in the United States as an illegal alien and returned to Mexico. And I said, does it feel different to travel in California in the Southwest? He says, it's almost like we haven't left Mexico for them. They feel very comfortable in that part of the United States. And so there was this free movements of people in which you didn't have to change your citizenship. I mean, that's the concept here that people forget. That simply because you have open borders doesn't necessarily mean that people change their citizenship. Somebody from France comes in, he flies into Dulles Airport, picks up his luggage, goes right on about his business. And he may stay here for a year or 2 years, but he doesn't need to change his citizenship. I have a friend who's a Japanese woman. She's been here for 25 years or so, and she teaches Japanese in the schools around here in Virginia. She doesn't change her citizenship. She retains her Japanese citizenship. Like, who cares? I mean, she's still a friend of mine. I'm not going to say, oh, you're not an American. And for today, you have over 1 million Americans living in Mexico. They retired there. They don't speak Spanish, most of them. They don't try. They don't eat Mexican food. They stuck with their hamburgers. They don't assimilate. They don't congregate with Mexican citizens. They all stay to themselves. And they root for the Dallas Cowboys or other American sports teams. And they retain their American citizenship. Like, who cares? And so that's what open borders does. It enables people to move back and forth. You'd have Mexicans coming up here to work seasonally, returning down to Mexico. Walls and fences produce the opposite result. People make their way up to the United States, and then they say, we're not going back because it'd be too difficult to come back again. So it achieves the exact opposite of what people who build the walls are trying to achieve. With open borders, you have this confluence of people, or harmonious relationships that are developing that produce economic prosperity. As you point out, immigrants are a gift to a society. They're usually the hardworking people. They're very enterprising. They have a strong family values usually. They want to make money. They want to do better in life. They want to become millionaires. And in that process, they produce this vitality, this energy that innervates a society. And we see this time and again. We saw it in the late 1800s in America, which was a time of great economic growth and prosperity. We see it in Argentina around the 1920s or so, where they had copied America's system of low taxes, open immigration, tremendous economic prosperity in Argentina. I mean, this is really the key, Richard, to what ails America is freedom and free markets.
Yes, if I can just mention a few other of the historical contexts. It's estimated by economic historians, demographers, that between 1840 and 1914, the year when the First World War began in Europe, approximately 60 million people left Europe to make new homes for themselves in other parts of the world. Of that approximately 60 million people, it is estimated that 35 million settled in the United States. In fact, when the census was taken in the year 1900, right, the population census is taken every decade. When the population census was taken in 1900, it was calculated that approximately 1/3 of the population of the United States was of immigrants or the children of immigrants directly. The other fact that should be kept in mind is that while all of these people came to the United States, to make your last point, again, the census figures suggest that out of that wave of immigrants, approximately 1/3 of them, at some point in their life, returned to the old country. They really didn't feel comfortable in the United States, culturally, linguistically, cut off from friends and family. So if they were successful, they had the capital to return to their home country for retirement. If they were not as successful, well, they could return home, and then they could just live comfortably among their own friends and family in their own community again. Others, such as the Chinese, often traveled to China in their older years so they could die and be buried with their ancestors, the importance of that in much of traditional Chinese culture. So the idea that people come and never leave, or they stay forever, has historically not been the case. But this was made very easy, both entering and exiting, because for like about the first 150 years approximately of the United States, there were no immigration barriers, there were no passports and no visas. Basically, it was a global world of freedom of movement. In fact, one free market economist referred to that 19th century period, including America's participation, as the era of the three freedoms: free movement of goods, free movement of money, and free movement of men. And that was a profoundly important epoch that was new to humanity, that people were individuals and could live, work, reside, travel wherever they wanted for whatever purpose, as long as they did so peacefully without violating the rights of others.
Yeah, that is a great point to make about freedom, because we're not only talking about the rights of immigrants to pursue happiness, which, as Jefferson pointed out, is one of the fundamental God-given rights that adhere in all human beings. Is it really these controls are an infringement and an attack on the freedom of the American people? I mean, American businesses, they own their businesses. That's what private ownership means. They have a right to hire whomever they want. That's part of being a free person, that it's your money. You decide what to do with your own money. If that's to hire a person from Guatemala or France or England, you have that right. And we also shouldn't ignore the tremendous assaults on freedom that come with immigration controls. This is what all too many advocates of liberty who favor immigration controls oftentimes forget, that with immigration controls come enforcement. You don't just have a law that says you cannot enter the United States without permission, because people are going to ignore that law. So you have to have enforcement vehicles to make sure that the law is enforced. And so you have these roving Border Patrol checkpoints along the border. You have the Border Patrol having the authority to go onto farms and ranches in the Southwest along the border and near the border. In fact, several miles from the border, where they can go onto people's ranches and farms without warrants, without the owner's consent, and search the premises. You have these checkpoints, highway checkpoints north of the border, and along the highway, the interstate highways running east-west, where it's surreal. You feel like you're entering into another country, where darker-skinned Americans are required to carry passports or other papers to show that they're an American citizen, even though the person never enters Mexico. These are all domestic passport checks, just like they have in totalitarian countries. And so that's the other thing we've got to keep in mind, Richard, is that we're not just fighting for the freedom of foreigners to exercise these fundamental God-given rights. We're fighting for our own freedom in terms of economic liberty and freedom of association as well.
Yeah, an extension of this, and which is obviously going to be the complement to the building of this wall, if in fact Trump follows through with it and Congress, allocates the funds and so on, is his matching attempt to wall America off from American enterprises establishing their plants and equipment and businesses in other countries. We're talking about here a tax and financial wall. Trump has made it very clear that if an American company wants to open a factory, for example, in Mexico, and manufacture its goods, its product in Mexico, and then re-import it into the United States, there will be, quote, a price to be paid for it. And that includes the imposition of a special high import tax on the re-imported goods. Now, who does this harm? Well, basically it harms the American consumer, and it harms the shareholders of the American company who is thinking of doing this, and it harms the people in countries like Mexico where jobs would have been created, which would have given them a higher standard of living. One element might have been their financial ability to buy more American goods that we export. The business enterprise is denied its liberty of free and peaceful operation and enterprise. The shareholders are denied the profit opportunity to peacefully invest in a company based upon their best judgment, carrying the risk of both profit and loss, to decide where is the most efficacious and advantageous location to place their plant and equipment and factory. And it harms the American consumer, because the American consumer is denied the opportunity to peacefully choose to buy the good that could be purchased, re-imported in the United States because of the more attractive, lower cost of manufacturing in a country like Mexico. Liberty is denied, violated, and intruded upon in many directions upon many people because of these policies that Trump is thinking of implementing.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a schizophrenia here, is that they're saying we don't want these Mexicans coming into America to work. But then when American businesses, for reasons of their own, try to establish businesses in Mexico, which would keep Mexicans there working, Trump takes the attitude, oh, no, we've got to punish these American businesses. We have to force them to stay over here and build a wall after creating this misery in Mexico by denying economic opportunity to Mexicans working for American companies to keep them out. I mean, it's just a really a hypocritical, two-faced policy. You know, there's reasons why American companies go into foreign lands. I mean, you're an economist, Richard. You teach these principles. I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that sometimes companies are leaving because the taxes and the regulations are so enormous here in the United States. And you want to do something constructive, you know, eliminate those taxes and regulations. But even in a free market society, people might find it beneficial to move to another part of the United States or move across into another country, and that these are all things that are economically beneficial in the long term. They benefit everyone on both sides of the border. So, yeah, this wall is going to be a horrible thing, and he's only going to be aggravating it with this notion that I'm going to punish American businesses for really exercising economic liberty and doing what they want with their own resources and what purports to be their own private property.
Yes, I think what we need to keep in mind is that not only does it have these negative effects if Trump implements these things, but other governments will respond. Once tariff barriers go up or are raised from where they had been, invariably it sets a dynamic in which the affected foreign countries, under pressure from their own constituents, feel that something has to be done. And then Mexico imposes tariff and trade restrictions on American exports into Mexico. And then that reduces the profit opportunities and the job opportunities in those American enterprises working in the United States who are earning revenues from selling in Mexico as conveniently, which of course then negatively affects Mexican consumers who are choosing to buy what probably was the less expensive American version of the product that was being imported into their land. All of this has a way of snowballing into an avalanche of beggar thy neighbor That is, to make the other country worse off in the attempt to improve yourself through trade restrictions, barriers, taxes, and anti-foreign rhetoric and propaganda.
Yeah, and lower our own standard of living at the same time.
Absolutely.
Richard, it seems to me you couldn't find a more classic example of isolationism. I mean, they also oftentimes accuse us libertarians of being isolationists because we want to bring the U.S. government and its imperial forces home and close down all the foreign military bases, stop the foreign interventionism. They call that isolationism when really it's just limited government. It's they who are producing the isolationist society by building this wall around America, isolating America from the rest of the world, and then compounded by the tariffs and protectionist measures. What they're doing is the exact opposite of what libertarians want to do. We want to bring the government home and limit it, restore a constitutionally limited republic to our land, and unleash the private sector to interact with the people of the world with open borders and free trade. They want to do the exact opposite. They want to unleash the federal government to continue stomping and bombing and assassinating and coups and regime changes while isolating the American people through trade restrictions as well as immigration controls.
Yes. In this way, President-elect, soon-to-be President Donald Trump, is threatening to move America into an not just economically disastrous direction, but an extremely dangerous direction for relationships with other parts of the world and to the freedom of Americans at home. As you were suggesting a moment ago, if you wanted to find out what is profitable to produce within the United States in the global division of labor, where jobs and investments seem most lucrative, eliminate the taxes and the regulatory spider's web that makes it often attractive for American enterprises to move abroad. And then in a freer trade environment globally, we will then discover where is it most economically advantageous for both the enterprisers searching for profit opportunities and the consumers who will buy those products to determine where enterprises, businesses, and employment should be located, sometimes here and sometimes other parts of the world. But if it's in a free market environment, that's decided by the forces of supply and demand, and in the long run benefit everyone and improve the standards of living of all.
Okay, well put. Well, on that note, we're out of time. Richard, enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all again for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of FFF. And, Richard, I will see you next week.
Absolutely. Our best wishes to our viewers and listeners.